Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. This is the North Korea Cybersecurity Threat Intelligence Briefing, and the security classification for this is green, meaning that this information can be freely shared as you wish. If you wish a copy of the slides, please email me directly. The email will be provided to you at the end of the presentation, or you could also email info@sensato.co, and we'd be happy to share the slides with you. Before we get started, if you do have questions, we will provide the ability for you to ask questions at the end of the presentation. For right now, everybody is muted. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Just a little bit of background on Sensato. We were started in 2013. The company focuses in 3 different areas: advisory services, assessments, guidance, penetration testing, strategy, and response. We also provide managed services, as well as our own cybersecurity software. The company has been selected 2 years in a row as one of the top 500 most innovative cybersecurity in the firms in the world. And we also are the founders and developers of the Cybersecurity Tactical Operations Center, or CTOC. Much of the information that we share with you today will come from our CTOC intelligence capabilities and some of the things that we do in that space. With that, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a disclaimer, and you can read this as you wish, but the long and short of it is that the information we present today as part of this briefing is to be used at your own risk and through your own decision. The information here is not warranted, and as you can expect, intelligence changes rapidly, as do the conditions that create this intelligence. So we ask that anything you do use, whether it be from us or other sources, you please vet carefully and assure that you use them in a manner that is in keeping with your corporate policies and regulatory requirements. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into a little bit about how we go about using intelligence and how we develop our intelligence. Sensato, from a threat intelligence life cycle, uses a variety of different steps as we work through presenting and quantifying intelligence. The first piece is we actually obviously would analyze the threat. We then do a large amount of intelligence gathering, both through open source and other means. We then process that intelligence that we gather, and at times that will lead us to go back to a threat intelligence gathering and/or threat analysis. We then move into the analysis and production stages, which is when we start to refine that intelligence and begin developing a thesis. We then do as best a job as we can to validate the intelligence from multiple sources. And we also exclude information that's derived from different sources. So we try to take a lot of time validating. And then we move into a dissemination phase. This is part of that dissemination phase, and we hope that you will be part of that as you share information with others as well. But we also ask you to please validate what we say and use the same steps that we do. Analyze what we're sharing with you today, validate it before you disseminate it or apply it. We do a good amount of projections in terms of where that threat intelligence will take us and what it could evolve, and we'll share a little bit about that today. And then we review our accuracy and use that as a key to learning for the next time that we are involved in a threat analysis. So with that, talk a little bit more about today's briefing, how it works, and what you'll be exposed to. We're going to talk a little bit about the current situational status. That'll be very quick and to the point. We'll then get into the threat background and hopefully share things with you that you may or may not know about North Korea, and then their strategic capability, their strategic options as we see them, and then end with some precautions and countermeasures that you may wish to take or put in place based on the information that we're providing with you. So the current situational status, where do we stand? Currently, we use MS-ISAC as our readiness kind of indicator in terms of where we stand as a country. This is not the same as a DEFCON level, but our current threat level is guarded, which means that there's a general risk of increased hacking and viruses. It's not the, kind of doomsday situation that we may be thinking, but it just means that there is an elevated risk to hacking and that people should take precautions in accordance with that. Now, I'd like to point out that this guarded position does not mean that it is specific to North Korea. It means as we look at all threats, and all capabilities of all actors across the world, as well as what they're taking on, that this leads us to a guarded position. It's very important to know that, and that we don't state that, hey, we're at a guarded position because of North Korea. That certainly would not be true. That said, North Korea's capabilities and recent activities do contribute to that position of being guarded. As I said, we use that, we get that situation is scored and maintained by MS-ISAC. If you're not familiar with MS-ISAC, we suggest that you do visit their website and that you do monitor their status. Many government agencies turn to MS-ISAC as an indicator of where we stand on our cyber threat levels. And we'll talk a little bit more in a little while about defense postures and how that relates to threat levels. But our current status, given all threats and all indicators, is guarded. So, you know, one of the things before we get into the strategic capabilities of North Korea is to keep in mind that for North Korea, cyber war is a very low cost and low risk means of operations, and they're actually very good at it. There's not been a lot that we've seen in the media specifically discussed about this or discussed in an intelligent manner, removing the emotion and just really thinking about them as an adversary and what that could mean to us or not mean to us. And we think it's important to look at both sides of that equation when we're evaluating threats. And hopefully that leads to separating fact from fiction. So the big thing, I think, the foundational thing is that they are invested and they are very good at cyber war capabilities and cyber attack. This statement, the reason that we put it up here is that it really does kind of quantify overall what we would view as their mission if we were to state it. And that is the ability to, in a low cost, low risk manner, meaning little chance of attribution at this point, to upset and retaliate against others. And the fact that it is an effective means to disrupt or neutralize, you know, is even a bigger reason that if we were them, this would be very certainly part of our mission in terms of how we would conduct cyber war and cyber attack operations. So let's talk a little bit deeper into them and kind of give you a little bit more information on their capabilities and what we see them. Some things that people may not know is that we actually know North Korea has had active cyber campaigns, not necessarily cyber war, but cyber attack campaigns reaching back to 2007. And it's an interesting situation because it actually clarifies the fact that they are very mature in terms of their cyber warfare capabilities. This is not something new. This is not something that started with Sony. We know that in some cases there is evidence that their capabilities may go back to as far as 2004. Now we suspect that that means that they were actually envisioning and standing up their cyber war capabilities. So just like we do here in the States, you know, we can't produce a military unit overnight. It takes time to put the charter together, the mission, fund the operations, describe the type of people we need, the training and readiness levels. So we believe that if they became active in 2007, they've actually been working on it since about 2004. The big takeaway for us, those of us on this call that are in a defense position, is that we need to be really cognizant of the fact that they are very mature. This is not, and often the mistake in media is that we paint people as being, you know, kind of off kilter or nuts or radical, and we do a disservice when we do that because we're not respecting the effectiveness of their capabilities, their intelligence, and their overall maturity. So I wanted to pull this out. We recently looked at a stack ranking of cyber warfare capabilities that remove NATO countries. And just to kind of, it's not in this deck, but I will share with you that when we looked at that, the number 4 most capable country in terms of cyber warfare capabilities across the world outside of NATO was North Korea, just to kind of give you some perspective on their ability and their maturity. And as we talk more about this, I think you'll start to appreciate their capabilities and exactly what they're able to do. They do have a formal cyber warfare group that is part of something called RGB, the Reconnaissance General Bureau. Depending on how you translate that, you may also see that as GRB, but it's the same group. This group includes 6 divisions or bureaus, if you will, each one charged with a different aspect of conducting either intelligence or cyber operations. In many ways, this reflects a combination of what we would call the CIA and NSA here in the States, with some overlaps. But these bureaus are charged with conducting operations, reconnaissance, their technology and cyber groups, overseas intelligence, inter-Korean talks, monitoring inter-Korean communication, and then subversive support, the administrative group. They have been evolving this capability for quite some time, and I'm hoping that by giving you further and further details on how they operate and what they do, that'll allow you to help you decide how and what position you want to take as you develop your strategies and your readiness and capabilities. They've grown their capability in terms of sophistication. One of the things they've become very good at is putting in place alliances. So one of the things that, for North Korea that is a force multiplier is the ability to reach out to other countries that are supporting them and put in place these pacts. And they're very strong, and again, not heard of often in common media or in most open source groups, but they are very strong in terms of their cyber alliances. So much so that we believe that the number of people they have, if you were adding in their alliances, could easily double or triple. So we saw that in 2012, there was an estimate that North Korea had about 1,800 personnel dedicated to cyber war operations. That doesn't mean that it's 1,800 hackers. Again, something that we often hear in the media is, oh, they have 1,800 attackers or hackers. I prefer the word attackers or operatives. And the reality is not all of these people are actually what we would consider to be an attacker. Many of them could be support personnel, logistics, management, and overhead. We do know, though, that that number has grown from 2012 to current day being approximately about 6,000. Now, it's an important piece to point out on this, that when we think of that, we need to step back against and understand what that means to us. And to be able to triple, to grow an organization, right, 6 times, just under 6 times, in that period of time is a very sophisticated process, right? If I brought, in most cases, when we deal with our members and clients, if we said, you got to go from 1,800 to 6,000 people, it's a daunting effort, right? Some of you may be thinking, if I had to go from 3 people to 6 people, it'd be a daunting effort. So think about the amount of overhead management, the amount of training, the sophistication that's required to make this happen. Now, we can debate how effective these people are, and we can debate whether or not how many of them are actual operatives and attackers. But I want you, before you take on that debate, to think about the fact that they have alliances, and they've been very effective in building those alliances. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. We believe that they have operations in about 50 countries. Now, this is an important piece of information because not all of their operatives are in North Korea. They actually have deployed operatives into other countries. So of these 6,000 North Korean personnel, that doesn't include their alliances, there may be operatives in other countries, and that's really important to keep in mind as we start to think about what their capabilities are. Again, part of the goal here when we do these threat intelligence briefings like this is to help you analyze the data on your own and kind of connect the dots and kind of come to these conclusions. So I'm giving you a little bit of background behind the curtains on what we're looking at and what's it mean that they're in 50 countries, and I'll come back to that in a moment. They are self-funding and revenue focused, meaning this group, unlike say NSA, CIA, DIA, or others in our country, in the United States, we don't have a revenue focus when we're doing attacks. One thing that RGB does very well is generate funds that come into the country through their operations. And so we'll come back to that in a moment. But again, that piece of information that they're able to generate these funds will hopefully help you understand a little bit more about their attack capabilities in the next coming pieces as we unfold this briefing for you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about organizational and operational insights. We do know from the previous pieces of information we just presented that they have worldwide operations. They have a distributed operative network. As I mentioned, there's 6,000 people, are around 40 to 50 countries. We have 50 because that's the outlier. We believe the minimum is at least 40 countries. The way they work is that they have valid employment, meaning that they are typically in these other countries working in valid positions. Now, these are countries that are typically friendly towards North Korea. So before you say, are they here? Are they working in our companies? Chances are no, they're not. But they are working in other countries. And that gives them the ability, if you think about it, to create these alliances. Now, when we typically think of an alliance, we're thinking of diplomatic alliances, things that may be done at a diplomatic level through embassies and consulates. When we talk about alliances in the context of this briefing, we're talking about covert alliances, which means that they can have alliances with criminal organizations, other nation states, or cyber terrorist groups. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So the valid employment is a cover, if you will. They may work as programmers, engineers, or whatever the case may be during the day, and have a clandestine tie during the night to carry out attack testing and recruitment focus. So they have a very large objective that we're operating in other countries to actually recruit people to help North Korea's cause in terms of cyber war. And also a test attack. So think about attacks you may have read about or heard about recently that were carried out that are attributed to a criminal organization. But there's now evidence gathering that if you look beyond that criminal organization, the attacks may have been stood up by North Korea or other nation states. And again, that's unfolding. And so please keep in mind that that intelligence and that implication is not completely vetted at this point. Their funding operations, when they're out and about, we'll talk a little bit more, but one of their big keys is not only to test attacks and what they can do, but also to recruit. Now, I want to step back on the attack testing. It's very difficult for many countries to test their cyber warfare capabilities because we're not willing, if you put aside all the conspiracy theories, to actually go and test our cyber war capabilities. We can test them internally, we can test them against cyber ranges and simulations. North Korea, using this model, actually has the ability to test their cyber warfare capability in real-world attacks and refine them. And this makes them a very powerful, mature model because they know what will or won't work. And I'll talk a little bit about things that they learn as they go. In terms of their alliance and partner development, we know that they have active alliances with Cuba, Iran, China, and the Middle East. Approximately 12 months ago to 14 months ago, we know the head of the RGB that oversees cyber war was in Cuba. And spoke about the fact that Cuba and North Korea have a common enemy and a common objective and missions, and that they should have a common capability in terms of cyber war. Again, we're going to come back to what these implications are and to why we're spending time analyzing their distributed capability. They can operate in very low-cost arenas. So typically when we see them recruiting or doing things, it's happening in coffee shops and not what you would consider the most sophisticated venues. Again, this helps lower their cost of operations and makes them very effective. They have very long-term development plans. So this, again, if they've been around since 2004, this is not something they're just standing up, but part of an ongoing, very effective and methodical mission and organizational capability. We do believe they have a sleeper capability, and I'll talk about that in a moment, which also means they probably have an assault, counter-assault capability. What this all means is that we don't really know where all their operatives are, what they're capable of doing. So in the event of a cyber war scenario between us and North Korea, or North Korea and us, we have to take into consideration that we could see attacks coming from other countries when these sleepers are activated, which can make for a very busy and politically challenging response, right? We can easily say take out North Korea, but when we start digging deeper and realize, well, they've got operatives in 40 to 50 countries, it's very possible that those operatives are awaiting an instruction to either wake up and attack or a counter-assault, right? We attack North Korea and suddenly we have a counter-assault capability that occurs out of some other country that we didn't realize. And I'm not saying at the country level, the nation state level, but at the operative level. All of this has to be factored into when you're thinking about your defenses and prevention. Again, there's a lot here to take in, and we'll talk more about it. I want to give you an example of their funding capabilities. So we know that over the past several years, this group, this RGB team, and this RGB is made up of different groups, Group 180, Group 121, Group 90. 180, Group 180, which is, I guess, a departmental name within their organization, is focused on financials. So they're ones that are going after financial organizations. and they've become very good at it. They're generating at about $100 million a year. Now you're asking, how do they generate it? They're generating it through criminal activities. Again, in our world, our government agencies cannot do that. We can't go break into a bank and just start stealing money or stealing people's ATMs funds or break into an ATM. These guys can, right? There's a loose tie between them and the government, so there's the ability to say, well, that's not us, it's some rogue people, and it gives them an arm's length capability. You know, the Bangladesh bank attacks that just occurred on the SWIFT network netted them about 81 million. So in all, they're having a really good year. What's interesting, when we look at the forensics behind that attack, we start finding out that the reason that attack came to light and was able to be uncovered, because the attack went on, the 81 million didn't take place all overnight, it took place over a period of time. The reality of life is that a spelling error in the word foundation is what thwarted the attack. They spelt the word foundation wrong. And if they wouldn't have done that, they would have continued to exfiltrate funds. And the belief is that it'd be somewhere in the area of $800 to $850 million is what they would have exfiltrated from the SWIFT network. Now, again, there's a lot that needs to be looked at, and the purpose of this discussion is not to focus on the Bangladesh attacks, but to highlight that they are a revenue-producing group. And from an intelligence perspective, if we're thinking about this from our vantage point, it means we need to think about, well, okay, if they've got funding coming in, what can they use those funds for? In most cases, it's to buy technology and to develop alliances, right? And go and pay a criminal organization to do something, fund an organization that is a cyber terrorist organization, you know, help drive initiatives with cyber spies or nation states, right? So when we talk about things and you hear in the media like, well, you know, North Korea is not very sophisticated and they don't have this technology and they're 10 years behind us, you need to step back and look at everything and really understand the comprehensive nature of all the inputs and outputs of this group, because it's much more sophisticated than we believe most people understand. They do have a very strong distribution network that not only includes their partners, and let me explain what I mean by distribution network. What I mean by that is, how would we distribute an attack? How do we get an attack out there? There's obviously the common ways, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but there's also, when you're conducting cyber war operations, you want a distribution network. Your distribution network becomes your kind of counter assault or sleeper cell group, right? And what that is simply I go and I give someone a set of code and say, if this occurs, you do this. I can also embed code in games, social platforms, mobility, and business applications. And we've seen this occur. We've seen attacks where North Korea has been implicated through something called the Lazarus Group that provides them with the ability to infect the games and commercial products, right? And what happens there is you end up downloading the game or installing something on an Android phone or one of the other OS phones, typically Android, and you become infected and you become a carrier. Now, that's a very interesting model, because what it means is you now not only have your alliances and your partners and your operatives distributed, but if you're able to infect a software and get it out into people's phones, we have a very strong botnet capability that's just built up in a sleeper cell mode. And I'm not trying to be conspiratorial. We're just looking at where the data and the evidence is pointing us. So please don't take away from this that we're in any way championing that there's a massive botnet sleeper attack on the horizon. We don't know. We just are looking at the intelligence and the operational capabilities of the organization and saying, if it was us, what would we do? How would we distribute attacks? And we find that based on their past history and their current capabilities, that this is viable. So let's talk a little bit about some of their historical context and attribution. So we know a lot about Sony. Most of you have heard or are intimately familiar with that. But we're also starting to see a lot of evidence that WannaCry and NotPetya also have ties to North Korea, directly or indirectly, meaning they either have enhanced the strains of those different tools, or they have helped fund operations utilizing those tools. And in both cases, you know, that intelligence is mounting and the evidence is mounting, but it's still not at a point where we can definitively say that, yes, they did this or that. And I think for most of us in this space, we know how hard it is to really lock down attribution. But one thing that's interesting and most people don't know is that Korea first tested a logic bomb back in 2007. So we have their nuclear testing has evolved, But what's interesting is the sophistication of their attacks and their capability have evolved at a very steadily, almost identical pace to their nuclear program. And the first time we see them actually testing a malware initiative was in 2007, and that led to a ban by the UN. On providing North Korea with those types of capabilities and tools. So again, it points to the fact that they're very committed. They've evolved their capabilities over time. And what we're seeing out of them now is not, we don't believe is totally everything they're capable of. We believe they have developed advanced attack platforms, and that they have used the funding that they generate from their financial attacks to build out that infrastructure and alliances. Keep in mind that it wouldn't be very difficult to hire a group of cyber consultants in another country to build things out for you if you don't have the sophistication and the capability in your country. So it's really important to keep this in mind, that if you hear people saying they're not a threat because they don't have the sophistication, then they truly don't understand the threat or the capability of North Korea. So let's talk about what they might do. Now, in this piece, in this context of the presentation and the briefing, I want you to really keep in mind that this is just us trying to connect some dots, and ultimately you need to really think about on your own what they might be or may not be capable of. You know, one thing about when we present intelligence, we are not going to argue with anyone that we're right or wrong. What we try to do is just basically present the information, and our biggest hope is really two things. One, that it causes people to think for themselves and analyze and come to their own conclusions. And secondly, that it causes people to review their capabilities and their countermeasures. And if we've done that, we're happy. You know, we'd rather be wrong 100% of the time and get people thinking than be right 100% of the time just for the sake of ego. So the type of attacks that we see based on everything we've just heard and we've analyzed is botnets. Now, that may not be surprising based on what I told you in the distribution network, but we do believe that their botnet capability is probably much stronger than we expect. And DDoS attacks. Now, the two things about both of these is conventionally when people talk about this, when we're referencing North Korea, is, well, they have a limited internet capability, right? We can just shut off their networks, take them down, disconnect them from the internet, and we're good, we're fine. That's true, and that's probably one of the first things we would do if in a cyber war against North Korea. But now we have to factor in some of the other intelligence. This is why I was telling you earlier, you got to really look at everything. And the piece here that we need to think about is they've got operatives in 40 to 50 countries that can provide a sleeper or counter assault capability. And there's nothing saying that they cannot acquire technologies in those countries to launch botnet or distributed denial of service attacks. So we cannot, again, just say, well, let's just, you know, they're not that technically sophisticated. They've actually done a great job since 2004, 2007 of creating a rather impressive infrastructure. The sleeper attacks we've talked about. We do believe that they are capable of prolonged attacks. They have a distributed network. They have the ability to follow the sun. They have alliances, and they have money. So they have all the recipes for a prolonged attack. For a prolonged attack, for those that don't know what that is any attack that typically goes over anywhere about 8 hours. Now, we're not talking the recovery process. We're talking about ongoing continued attacks. Think about a botnet attack or DDoS attack or keyboard-to-keyboard attack or polymorphic attack that lasts 8, 16, 24, 72 hours. That's a very, very serious situation that most organizations cannot stand up to. And one of the things we'll talk about that you should think about when you're planning your responses and your countermeasures. The attack methodologies we believe they'll employ are a crawl, walk, run. Although we believe they could just launch an all-out cyber war initiative, we don't think that is ultimately what they'll do. We believe that they'll attack first common vulnerabilities, and I'll explain why we don't believe that in a moment. So they'll go after common things, you know, the common CVEs, what we know is vulnerable at this point in time, and do that and create what we consider kind of a harassment technique. You know, we're able to do it, we can get in when we want, you know, you better plug up your servers. Second one is deploy custom attacks and exploits. We think that we will see some things from them that we go, wow, we didn't realize that could happen. We think they do have that level of sophistication to carry off attacks that are beyond just common vulnerabilities. Now, obviously that would need to exploit something, but we think with their distribution network, they could get in and cause some issues beyond just exploit attacks. And then obviously they could launch sleepers and deploy their alliances and partners. But we see this kind of as a stepping, right? Start with attacking common vulnerabilities, deploy custom attacks, launch your sleepers, and then deploy alliances and partners. And that would make for a very, very effective strategy around cyber war from our vantage point. And again, we try to always, as a company, think of things from the attacker's perspective. So when we put these things together, we're thinking about, well, if we had to do this, what could we do? How could we viciously go after someone and meet our objectives? And this is kind of what we believe. So what are the targeting options and where? We believe that one of the first areas they would go after is the financial industry. Now, part of this is because they're so successful with the finance industry as it is, that Group 180 and their ability to generate revenue and go after things like SWIFT and the Bangladesh attacks. So we think their history of successful attacks against this sector would continue. We believe there's two reasons for that. One is obviously they can generate revenue and disruption, but the bigger one is quality of life. We think that given their leaders a requirement to kind of be seen as a very powerful figure, and that North Korea is this force to be reckoned with, we believe that ultimately they want to disrupt quality of life. And this is different than what we typically would see in most cyber war strategies, where you're going after defense industry, trying to take out military systems. We don't think that ultimately North Korea would go after that. I think they believe, or we believe, that they would target quality of life, which means destroy confidence and evolve the belief that they are a very strong, force to be reckoned with. Get us to question our leadership. Get us to question: is it safe to go to a healthcare organization? Is it safe to use the ATM? Is it safe to use online media and gaming? That has a much more debilitating effect for a country like North Korea than simply taking out our radar systems. And the ability for them to do that is probably not as easy. But to go after and impact quality of life from a cyber war capability would be a very, very strong attack that would have individual impact on each and every one of us. We think after that, they would probably go after business systems and lastly, critical infrastructure. Now, again, we're basing this on a combination of what we know about their capabilities from the intelligence that we've seen and heard, and from their leaders' posturing and prioritization of what he's trying to do from a perspective of propaganda and threats that he's issued. So that's kind of where we've come on those targeting options. Please do not take this as an end-all be-all in terms of targeting options. This is very fluid, and it's imperative that you kind of connect the dots on this. So that kind of brings us to precautions and countermeasures. What should you consider? And again, this is really more of a consideration by you as to what would make sense or not. Some of this is going to be very, very, well, that's the same as any other threat. And it is, right? There's only so many things we can do as defenders, but we are going to try and hopefully highlight some things here that many of us know. But really, if you believe that North Korea is a threat and has the capability, you may want to accelerate or strengthen and evolve your capabilities in this area. One is to maintain a guarded and vigilant posture. You need to continue thinking about threat intelligence, how you're getting it, where you're getting it, and most importantly, how it's changing. We could find that, as we did with Guam, that North Korea backs down or changes their methodology. And so it's important to understand that. Continue to question, why are they speaking to Cuba? What does that mean? Does it have implications for us? So maintaining a guarded and vigilant posture is really important. This is not the end-all be-all threat briefing, and it should not be. Vulnerability disclosure. If we're right in one of their first attack methodologies or options is to go after vulnerabilities, then you really need to, at least with external facing system and your internal segment network systems, close down as many vulnerabilities as possible. It's really important. We know that everybody does that or talks to it, but the ability to do it is something that often comes to light as not being actually followed. We do know that there are ways to get past patch systems. We all know that. And so it's not just patching, but this is a good way to kind of address some of that low-hanging fruit with these, not only them, but obviously any other attacker that's out there. We could see prolonged operations, as we discussed. They have the ability and the funding and the desire. So how you respond to that is important. A fast capability, the reason we're throwing this in there is a hedge. be very honest, if we're wrong and we don't see a crawl, walk, run execution of their strategies, but rather we see a fast attack, such as WannaCry, that sweeps across industry and across countries, you need to really understand your fast attack strategies and tools. It's really important. As a company, we've come out with entire methodology on this, but however you do it, whatever you do, whoever you work with, you need to think about what do you do in a fast attack situation? What if Sensato is wrong on this? It's not crawl, walk, run, and they just throw everything they've got at us. How do you respond? What do you do? Interestingly enough, the biggest thing we recommend everybody is to focus on process improvement and response. We believe most people have a good level of tech, but that really it's about that last mile of really becoming kind of a world-class cybersecurity organization. And in this instance of North Korea, some of the things we look at in terms of the defense strategy around process is an executive and board briefing. You're welcome to these slides. We'd be happy to do a board briefing for you. Feel free to use these slides and talk to your board about here's what we're seeing, here's the sophistication level, here's something we need to be aware of. Our world is kind of changed, and until something changes with North Korea, this is the world we live in. So feel free to use this and make it available to your boards and your executives and managers. Over the past 6 months, we've been really pushing this concept of a DEFCON protocol deployment. Now, there is stuff in NIST and other areas that you can use. You can use the readiness level from MS-ISAC and others. The problem is, as we've talked about in the past, that does not really translate very well to non-techies. So I may be able to look at one of you on this phone, on this briefing, and you may understand what I mean by guarded or elevated because you're in this world. But if you go to a CEO or COO or CFO or someone on a board or another manager in the organization, you say, we're at level guarded, they probably don't know what that means. Pretty much because of the media and the movies we've seen, everybody understands DEFCON protocols, DEFCON 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you adopt that DEFCON protocol for your organization and come to terms as part of your security ops, that on DEFCON 1, this is what you do, and if you move to DEFCON 2, you do this. Now, you don't move from DEFCON 1 to 2 to 3 just because the threat levels have changed. You move because there's a cause and effect. You're seeing certain things evolve because of intelligence, and you decide we need to move the organization to DEFCON 2. We're now in a readiness posture. And that's going to mean something. It's going to mean either, you put in place certain things, you restrict access to the internet, you shut down social media, you stop file sharing. It's going to be different for every organization. But having DEFCON protocols allows you to communicate with others and have a conversation around what is going to happen when the organization moves to a specific defense position. And so this is probably one of the most important things you can do, irrespective of North Korea, but just talking about how do you prepare and set up to deal with a cyber war scenario or a massive, fast-moving attack. So this is probably the biggest thing we would tell you to put in place and to make it a priority, if not this year, which we understand everybody's got plans, is to make it part of your 2018. I say that with hesitancy because if you asked us how important it is, we would tell you get it done as soon as you can. And then revisit your IR plans. We're finding that a lot of people we work with, when we look at their incident response and we do tabletop exercises with them, they don't have some of the more new things that have come to light. How do you deal with prolonged operations? What do you do if it's a 72-hour ongoing operation? Not the incident response is 72 hours, but you guys are dealing with a 72-hour ongoing attack. What about fast? What happens with a fast moving attack? And, how do you respond to that? What's the realistic capability of the organization? And a cross-industry response. We've been seeing this. We just saw this up in Buffalo, where there's a situation where one industry's hit and other industries are affected. And what do you do in that situation from a resourcing and priority perspective? So please revisit the IR plans. And then lastly, in this day and age, not having a security operations center is hard. It's hard to deal with all these types of attacks and DEFCON levels and readiness levels and not have some form of security operations center. Obviously, selfishly, we'd love it for us to be that SOC for you. But if it's not, then do something and make sure that whoever you choose is going to be able to stand by you and guide you through something of this magnitude if it were to occur, and also guide you through the little things because those are obviously more prevalent and need more attention. So I want to close out before we talk about questions with this. Reality is we've never seen a cyber war. So anything's possible. We are looking at North Korea. We will continue to look at them. We will do updated threat intelligence briefings as we get new information and things change. Obviously, if we see something happen with them, we would move into in our case, a higher DEFCON level and be disseminating information to our clients and members on a real-time basis. But for now, we need to understand the people we're dealing with in North Korea are not playing by the rules, and by that we need UN and other regulations regarding war and cyber war, which there's a whole body of law around, and that changes the game. And the fact we've never seen one is kind of interesting yet scary all at the same time. And it's an amazing time in history to kind of see that this is possibly there, that we could see a cyber war. And each and every one of us will be questioned about how we respond and the decisions we make and the strategies that we put in place. So with that, if you have questions, you can type them into the group chat window, and I'll do my best to answer them. If we don't know, we will obviously let you know that we don't know. But that's kind of what we had for you today. If you'd like to ask something privately, feel free to email myself or Mike Chirico. Our email addresses are on the screen. And you can also certainly follow us on Twitter. So with that, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the group chat window in the Zoom system. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions. Hopefully that's because we were able to cover the information in a way that was meaningful to you. But if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out. Again, our email addresses are on the screen, and we do truly appreciate you spending time with us this afternoon. Really, truly hope that it was meaningful and valuable, and most of all, does those two things we discussed, gets you to think and come to your own conclusions, as well as, consider your posture and your strategy. So with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to the next time.